Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Relationship and Truth, and it's finally here, the third part in our Van Bruggen series, responding to his little pamphlet, The Ancient Text of the New Testament. This response series is called Responding to Dr. Van Bruggen. Is the majority text the right text? And this particular part, part 3, is called Beyond All Plausible or All Possible Doubt. And exactly why that is the case, well, hopefully you'll see as we go. But before I get into the response, as I did with the other parts responding to Van Bruggen, I want to point out some important things about this discussion. We're talking about which version of the New Testament text is correct. Which version of the New Testament text should Christians be using? And Dr. Van Bruggen is a proponent of what is called the majority text. I am a proponent of the critical text, and there are definitely some differences there. Otherwise, there wouldn't be different positions, right? But like I said in the previous parts, this is a division that, though it exists, it is not as significant as a lot of other divisions that can occur between people of faith. And this is a difference that I would say can occur between people of the faith. That is, just because I disagree with Dr. Van Bruggen regarding which text of the New Testament ought to be used as a basis for translation, as a basis for sermons, so on and so forth, just because I disagree with him on that issue doesn't necessarily mean that I think that Dr. Van Bruggen is a false Christian or anything like that. And the same thing would go for a lot of my majority text friends. There are people I know that would be in favor of the majority text, and they would believe significantly false doctrines, significant heresies, and those people I would not call a brother or sister in Christ. But this particular issue of majority text versus critical text isn't one of those things. That is, generally, if people are consistent in their exegesis of the scriptures, regardless of whether they are in favor of the majority text or the critical text, they will believe in the same fundamental God of the Bible. They will still believe in the same fundamental gospel of the Bible. And because of that, we can still extend the right arm of fellowship, as it were, to each other in these cases. As I've pointed out previously, even in my own church, there are people who are proponents of the majority text, and I go there as well, and we manage not to kill each other every time we walk into the church together. And this is something that I want to make sure I reiterate, is that this is a discussion between brothers in the faith, not between Christians and non-Christians, not between the insiders and the outsiders, but this is between people who on both sides of the aisle will believe in the same God and who will believe in the same gospel. We agree on all the essential areas of doctrine. We might support them differently, but we agree on all the essential areas of doctrine. And in so much as that is the case, we need to make sure that we're treating each other very well. This is one of the things that the Bible speaks of in saying that they will know that you are Christians by your love, and specifically by your love for one another. And when you love your brother, you're going to take the time to try to represent them accurately and represent them well. It doesn't mean that you don't talk about the differences, but the way that you talk about those differences is going to be different than you would talk about issues with other people. And one of the ways in which it should be different is that there's going to be a lot more grace that's extended, hopefully. You need to be accurate and truthful as always. Those are always going to be Christian standards. And you don't stop the standard of accuracy and truthfulness just because you're dealing with a brother in the Lord. But it definitely needs to be seasoned with grace. And I try to do that, and unfortunately I don't always succeed, and I apologize for that. But hopefully people will see my heart in this, and that is I'm not saying all this in order to tear everybody down who happens to be a majority texter. I'm saying this because I'm honestly concerned about the issue. I believe them to be wrong, and I'm trying, as a brother in Christ, to show them where there are errors, and I'm trying to make sure that I actually respond to what they're actually saying. And that's why I've actually decided to go through Van Bruggen's pamphlet and actually get from him what he is saying. Alright, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this third part. As I have in the previous parts, I'm going to start by presenting Van Bruggen's material. The first part is going to be Van Bruggen's response to antiquity-based arguments for the critical text. Obviously, I'm not Van Bruggen, so I'm not going to present it exactly like he would, and obviously I'm not on his side of the aisle, and so there's going to be certain biases. When you listen to this presentation, be aware of that, but the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to try to represent Van Bruggen as accurately as I can. As I've suggested before, getting a copy of his little pamphlet, which is not overly expensive at all, and you can get it on Amazon, at least last time I looked you can. His little pamphlet, The Ancient Texts of the New Testament by Jacob Van Bruggen, is something that I would definitely recommend so that you get his arguments in his words. Well, technically it's kind of in translation, but still, that's the best representation that we have in English for his argument. And then after I present his side of the issue, at least as best as I can, I'm going to go ahead and interact with it. So the second section is going to be my interaction with Van Bruggen's claims in this third section of the Ancient Texts of the New Testament. And then finally, we're going to include another part in the ongoing discussion of textual criticism for the believing proponent of the critical text, part 3. That is, in all of these parts, I've presented Van Bruggen stuff, I responded to Van Bruggen stuff, and then I put forward the issues on the text critical side. For people who are in favor of the critical text and who are also believers, here's the issues that they're dealing with, here's the concerns that they have, here's what they believe, at least in part. I don't have enough time to go over everything that could be said, but a lot of the things that I believe to be significant and relevant, and at the very least, good points that need to be talked about and discussed, at the very least. Alright, so that's where we're going. We'll start off with Van Bruggen's material in this third section. Alright, so for the next little bit here, I'm going to be acting as a proponent of the majority text, which I'm not. So, like I said, yeah, there's going to be bias and all those things, but I'm going to try to represent him as accurately as I can in so much as I understood him. Alright, so first thing that he wants to get across in this section, as far as I can tell, is the point that proponents of the critical text wrongly appeal to the age of manuscripts. This third section, that's basically how he starts out, by saying that, you know, a lot of times when critical texters are asked, well, why do you go with this reading versus the readings that we have in our text? One of the things that gets brought up is, well, this is the earlier reading. And Van Bruggen goes directly against that and says, no, you shouldn't be arguing from the age of the manuscript. And the basic reason that he gives for this is that the age of a manuscript and the age of the text it contains can differ. For example, young manuscripts can be copies of much older documents and therefore represent an older text than their age would suggest. If you had a text from, say, the 9th or 10th century that was a copy of something that was from the 2nd century, well, yeah, technically the manuscript is young. It's a 9th or a 10th century manuscript. But if it's copying something that was substantially earlier than it, well then, even though the manuscript itself is young, the text that it contains actually comes from a very early source. And because of that, the age of the manuscript itself doesn't mean a whole lot. The question is, what is it copied from? Is it being copied from other stuff that's late, or is it being copied from other stuff that's early? And if all that you do is you just look at the age of the manuscript itself and you don't distinguish that from the text that it contains, what was that text actually being copied from, then you can wind up with inconsistencies. Therefore, critical text proponents, in order to dismiss the majority text, must actually prove that the majority text itself is young, rather than proving that the manuscripts that contain it are young. That is, a lot of times critical texters will just say, well, the young manuscripts say this thing, but the older and better manuscripts, they say this other thing. And Van Bruggen's point is that that's not actually proving what needs to be proved. What you need to prove is that the majority text, that those late manuscripts don't actually have an early text. How do you know that even though the manuscripts are late, how do you know they weren't copied from things that are perhaps just as old or even older than the old manuscripts that you prefer? Have you actually done the legwork to show that, to prove that? And then Van Bruggen gets into the argument, because there are people in the past who have sought to do this with the majority text, to prove that the majority text not only comes from younger manuscripts, from later manuscripts, but also that the text that it contains is younger, that the text that it contains is older. And of course, one of the people who did this originally was Hort. Van Bruggen responds a great deal to Hort, and I've explained that in the first couple of parts, that really is where Van Bruggen's primary emphasis is on Hort. And one of the things that Hort did is Hort appealed to the pre-Nicene Church Fathers. So he goes back through the historical catalog of all the early dudes who were Christians, and he sees that in the ante-Nicene period, that is before the Council of Nicaea, so before the early 4th century, AD that is, so before the early 4th century, we don't have any church father citing the majority text, or what would become the majority text. It doesn't occur. And so Hort said, on the basis of this fact, that no pre-Nicene fathers use the majority text, we have confirmation that in fact the majority text is young. Not only does it not show up in the older manuscripts, but it also does not show up in the early church fathers. And Van Bruggen steps into this and he says, well, is that really good logic? He first points out that citations from the church fathers need to be treated with caution. And why? Because there are changes that can occur with transcription. That is, the early church fathers, they wrote down what they wrote down, sometimes through the aid of a scribe, but they wrote down what they wrote down. And those things that they said don't come to us directly. Instead, what they said to us, what they wrote down that eventually has come to us, went through a process of hand copies, just like everything else in the ancient world was. If it was a written document in the ancient world and you wanted to disseminate it, either through time or across space, you needed to make hand copies in order to do so. And in the process of hand copying something, it can change. And so saying what a church father did or did not have is sometimes a little bit of a sticky issue, because there are textual issues even in the church fathers. For example, a lot of the Eastern church fathers will have a Greek version of what they said, and there'll also be a Latin translation somewhere along the line of what they said. And the two versions can differ by not an insubstantial amount. They can differ quite a bit. And so those translational and transcriptional kinds of differences that are involved in hand copying can become a major impediment to saying what did they have and what did they not actually have. Another issue that occurs with the church fathers is that they had a tendency to paraphrase. That is, access to books like we have was just simply not something that they had. A lot of times, there would only be a few copies of a particular book at most that a church father would have access to. And they usually wouldn't have access to it all the time. The early church fathers a lot of times had to memorize the text in order to keep it with them, so they'd have the opportunity to read it, at one major point in their lives, or during one part of their lives at least. And any other time that they needed to reference it, they were pulling from memory to do so. And because of that, there are a lot of times where the church fathers are talking about biblical passages, but they're putting it in their own words. They tend to paraphrase it because they don't remember exactly what it was. And so the early church fathers on the whole do have a tendency to paraphrase. And the same thing occurs even in the modern age, where people are citing or referencing scripture off the top of their head. They say that they know that there's a scripture that talks about this. They can't remember exactly what it says, but what it basically talks about is this. Well, that's a paraphrase. It's really hard to figure out exactly what form of the text the person is going with if they're saying, well, it basically said this. So that's a problem with using the church fathers, is that sometimes they didn't know exactly what the text read because they're just pulling it from memory. Another issue with the early church fathers is the issue of geographical isolation. Travel and communication in the ancient days was not what it is today. There was some travel, there was some communication, but it's not like they could just, hop on their laptop and check their emails and, send photocopies to each other of the different manuscripts that they have and compare and contrast that way. Oftentimes there was a lot of isolation, and if they happen to be in an area that didn't have particularly good versions of the text, well, their citations are going to be off as well. They're not necessarily going to be representative of the whole. They're going to be representative of what they had in their particular time and space, and that may or may not correspond to what was going on in other places at other times. And sometimes it wouldn't even be representative of the region as a whole, just them, what they had. And then finally, another issue that you have with the early church fathers is their philosophical and doctrinal dispositions. We all have traditions. We all have a particular set of lenses on that are very hard to take off. We take our history with us, as it were. And a lot of the early church fathers, before they became Christians, were oftentimes very much so steeped in the culture around them. Before they were Christians, they were pagans. Before they were Christians, they were Jews. Before they were Christians, they belonged to some other sect, or some even heretical group. And all of those different influences would sometimes remain with them to one extent or the other. It is very hard to completely filter all those things out coming into Christianity. And so how much of their use of Scripture and the way that they decided to recite Scripture was influenced by all those lenses that they took with them, by their history as a pagan, or their history as a Jew, or their history as some kind of a heretic. How much of that influenced their understanding of the text is really hard to know sometimes. And in some cases, it's pretty obvious that there's a lot of influence that is not coming from the text itself, but instead is being thrust upon the text. So the first thing that Van Bruggen would point out in using the church fathers in this way to prove that the majority text is young is that, well, the church fathers aren't always the best source. There's a lot of problems with the church fathers and relying on citations from them. Next, the earliest writings that we have are from Egyptian and Western fathers, while we have no representation from early Antiochian fathers. Hence, the extant data is biased towards the least reliable church fathers due to heresy and persecution. What is it that Van Bruggen means here? This is on pages 22 and 23, by the way. And I've put all the references in here. The TATNT is a reference to the ancient text of the New Testament, the little pamphlet that Van Bruggen put out, and then of course the page references coincide with that. So if you want to see where I'm getting this material, you can look at those pages and read it for yourself. But the next thing that Van Bruggen would like to point out here is that the earliest writings that we have are from the Egyptian fathers and the Western fathers. We don't have any early Antiochian fathers. So in early Christianity, there's lots of different areas that were Christian. And Egypt is one place that had early Christians. Rome is, of course, one place that had early Christians, the Western world as a whole. And another place that had Christians, of course, would be the area around Asia Minor and Greece. And one of the major cities in that general region was, of course, Antioch. And Antioch was one of the major sees of early Christianity. The problem, though, is that while we have early writings that come from the southern region, the Egyptian region, and we have early writings that come from the western region. We don't have a lot that come from the northeast, from Greece and Asia Minor, the area around Antioch. We don't have basically any really early church fathers that come from there. We do get some later on, but really early on, we don't have any from there. And then another issue that we have with the Western and the Egyptian fathers, from the guys that we do have, what we do know of them is that they were embroiled in conflicts and heresies pretty early on. And of course, this was also during the age of Roman persecution. That is, during this time in history, prior to the 4th century AD, Christianity was illegal. It was an illicit religion. And in the 4th century, that changed. It went from being an illicit religion to being a licit, that is, legal religion in the 4th century. But prior to that, it was illegal and persecuted in various phases at various times. But there was a lot of persecution that would happen early on. And one of the things that would happen as a part of that persecution is that the Romans would come in, figure out wherever the local church was, and go and basically steal or coerce people to give them the manuscripts that the church was using, and then they would subsequently destroy them, oftentimes burning them. And so the persecution in these areas results in the removal of a lot of the church's primary texts. Romans would come in, they'd find the church, take the manuscripts, destroy them. Well, the church manuscripts that the church actually keeps in the church itself are usually going to be what they would consider to be their best versions of the text. And the Romans kept coming in and destroying those. So the version of the text that you're going to wind up with after a while isn't going to be representative of those best versions. And then, like I said, these early groups, when we see them in history show up, they're often embroiled in controversies at a pretty early stage. For example, one of the earliest and most pernicious of heresies that occurred in early Christianity was the era of Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is a really nasty heresy that, among other things, and Gnosticism is not completely monolithic, but one of the traits of a lot of early Gnostics, not all of them, but a lot of early Gnostics, is that they basically took a giant axe and divided the Bible right between the Testaments, and then even within the New Testament, they would cut things out. So basically, they didn't like the God of the Old Testament, thought he was mean, nasty, angry dude. The Jesus of the New Testament, he seemed like a much more pleasant fellow, but there's still lots of parts of the New Testament that talk about God's wrath and things like that, so they would get rid of a lot of that kind of stuff. Very much so kind of a pick and choose kind of religion. You know, we like some of your Christian ideas, but we don't like these other things and all that kinds of things. It was just absolutely awful. And these heretics, these Gnostics, were known to have their own versions of the text. And these versions of the text were known in the West and in the southern region and the Egyptian region. This is where our early records come from, and this is what our early records speak of. They speak of these heretics being around, and they also speak of these early persecutions that would remove a lot of the best manuscripts, and these heresies that would produce texts that had been altered. And so the places that we do have producing early church writings are places that are pretty messed up when it comes right down to it. There's lots of nasty things that are happening in those regions. And so Van Bruggen's point is, well, relying on church fathers that are from areas that are having problems is probably not a good idea. And there's a part of the map that is not represented at all. The Antiochian region it's not even on the map. If we had early writings from them, who knows what it would look like? We only have from these other regions that we know had problems. If we had writings from these other guys, well, the story might be a little bit different. So appealing to these guys in the southern region and in the West, doesn't give us a whole picture, and the picture that we do have from those regions is muddled. Van Bruggen goes on to say, Van Bruggen goes on to say that sometimes the church fathers followed their own text type. That is, there have been textual scholars in the past who have proposed that the church fathers actually have a distinct text type that is not found in the manuscripts, but it is something that is unique to them. They represent even a different line of transmission even than we have in the manuscripts. Another issue that comes up with the church fathers is that the same evidence that can be used to argue that they follow the critical text, because that's what some people do, they look at the early church fathers, especially the pre-Nicene ones, the ones that come before the 4th century, before Christianity became a licit religion, a legal religion. They look at the early period, the pre-Nicene period, and they look at the writings from the early church fathers, and they start counting variants. Here's a time where the church father quotes a specific section of text, and this section of text lines up with the critical text, and it doesn't line up with the majority text. And what Van Bruggen is pointing out is that the people who are doing this analysis of saying, okay, what do these early church fathers match up with when they quote the text, he points out that a lot of the time you can actually argue either way with a particular thing. And I'm going to get into that in more detail when I talk about my response to this. But for right now, the point is that there's a lot of people who look at these analyses and they look at the exact same person. One person looks at, say, an early church father like Aphrayat the Persian, and they look at his writings and say, well, most of the time he quotes a version of the text that is most similar to the critical text. And another person looking at the exact same evidence will say, well, no, most of the time he picks a version of the text that is most similar to the majority text. So you have people who are looking at the exact same evidence and coming to different conclusions. And if you can come to different conclusions from the exact same evidence, then the evidence must not be all that good. It must not be all that decisive, at least not as decisive as a lot of people would like to make it out to be. Fourth, the earliest Antiochian writings that we do have are in line with the majority text and are not treated as a new text in the writings of the 4th century. So what Van Bruggen's point here is that okay, we don't have any Antiochian writings early on that come from this northeastern region. We don't have any of those writings early on. But when they do show up in history, they tend to be in line with the modern majority text. And at the time, it's not like everybody was saying, oh, you Antiochians are doing this weird, crazy thing that none of us have. It seems to go unnoticed. And so if it was something that was brand new, that had never been known before, why would it be unnoticed? If it was something that was completely brand new, it seems like somebody should have noticed it. But Van Bruggen's argument is that you don't get that. People aren't calling out these Antiochian church fathers for introducing something new and weird. And the Antiochian fathers, early on, seem to have a form of the majority text at a very early point, as basically as far back as we can get writings from that region. Fifth, by the way, Van Bruggen had a lot of points in this particular section. This is one of the longer sections in this pamphlet. Fifth, it is probable that the Antiochian church had one of the earliest and best libraries of Christian writing since it was founded early on and was a missionary base used by Paul and Barnabas. Hence, the earliest writings that we do have from it are more likely to be representative of the ancient New Testament text than early writings from other places. So this is what Van Bruggen has in mind. He says, okay, here's a region that we don't have a whole lot of early evidence from in terms of early church fathers writing from there. In the ante-Nicene period, we basically don't have anyone who is writing from this region that we have writings that come down to us from, at least. Obviously, there were people there and there were Christians there, but we don't have any of their stuff, so we don't know what they said. But what we do know about the Antiochian region is that it was influenced by Christianity very early on. It's the place that's associated with Paul and Barnabas, even in the Bible. It's a missionary place. That is where Paul and Barnabas went out on their missionary trips, and thus these people would have had an interest in what was going on in these other areas. And so when manuscripts came in from these other areas, they're going to tend to be much more careful about them and making sure that they get copied and those kinds of things, and storing copies and things like that. And so Van Bruggen's argument is that while this is kind of a silent area on the map for the first few centuries of Christian history, what we do know about it early on from the Bible itself is that this is an area with some good solid Christians that were doing good solid Christian work that would have had a vested interest in maintaining the Bible as purely and accurately as possible. And because of that, the evidence that we do have that comes from there needs to be given a lot more preeminence and priority in our thinking. Van Bruggen's third main point. He says, the fact that most of the older manuscripts contain a different text type than the majority text does not prove that the majority text is young, since such assumes that the extant early manuscripts are representative of their time of production. To put that in more simple terms, Van Bruggen has just got done saying, well, looking at the early church fathers as evidence isn't good. He's already said that, the issue is how old is the text, not the manuscript. A late manuscript can have a very early text. And appealing to the early church fathers doesn't work very well, because the early church fathers are kind of an odd bunch. They come from one geographic region and they exclude another geographic region. They themselves can be very unreliable in the way that they say things, and they can paraphrase and all these other things. But even looking at the manuscripts and appealing to the manuscripts also causes problems. When you look at the manuscripts, and you look at the manuscripts through history, most of the early manuscripts do in fact not read with majority text. They don't fit the modern majority text. And that would only be significant, Van Bruggen argues, if those early manuscripts are actually representative of their time and place. That is, if you're going to appeal to these early manuscripts, what you're also saying is that these early manuscripts are actually representative of what's going on early on. And Van Bruggen is saying that that might not be such a great argument. In fact, he would say that that's not a good argument at all. And he goes through and he breaks down some of the categories of these early manuscripts and saying, here's reasons why they are not representative of their time. The first category that he looks at are the early papyri. The papyri are the earliest manuscripts that we have. And he points out a very blatant fact about these papyri. He says, first, the papyri are not representative since they only come from Egypt and are probably not the best copies that were available in Egypt. So these are the earliest manuscripts we have, but they only come from one place on the map, Egypt. And that's it. We don't have papyri that come out of Antioch. We don't have papyri that come out of Rome. We don't have papyri that come out of the Grecian Peninsula or anywhere else. Egypt is the only place we have ever found papyri manuscripts of the New Testament. That's it. Only in Egypt. And so you don't have a representation of what is going on in the whole world. And then on top of that, the papyri that we do find, we usually find somewhat incidentally. And most scholars would agree, even on the critical text side, this is interesting, even on the critical text side, most scholars would agree that a lot of the papyri manuscripts, maybe not all, but a lot of the papyri manuscripts are not particularly good copies. You look a lot of the early manuscripts, and they're not particularly well done. Sometimes the penmanship isn't so great. The kinds of mistakes that they make, I seem sometimes like they're fairly simple mistakes that more or less would be associated with novices, novice scribes, people who don't write all that often or all that much, or perhaps are in a rush, things like that. They don't seem like they're very carefully well made. There's a lot of issues with these early papyri manuscripts, and there's a lot of them that they don't appear to be particularly good manuscripts. And like I said, a lot of critical text proponents would also agree with that a lot of the papyri are not particularly good examples of what would have been the best available manuscripts in their day. A lot of them just simply aren't very good. They're not very well made. So they come from one particular place, and they're probably not the best manuscripts that were available in that place. Van Bruggen goes on to say that the majuscules, which is the next major category of manuscripts, the earliest ones are the papyri, and the next major category is the majuscules. And he says that the majuscules are not representative, since it was the best manuscripts that were predominantly transcribed into minuscule form, which is the next category over. So there's the papyri first, then the majuscules, and then the minuscules. And the minuscules generally do read along with the majority text. And Van Bruggen is saying that the majuscules that come before them aren't representative of their own time, because it was the best manuscripts that were predominantly transcribed into minuscule form and then destroyed, meaning that most of the surviving majuscules are ones that weren't good enough to be copied and then destroyed. So Van Bruggen's point is that when the scribes decided to transcribe a text, they would go ahead and just transcribe it. Okay, this is the one that we want to copy. And then after they were done copying it, they would destroy it. They would take it out of circulation. You've renewed the text. You've transcribed the text. You don't need this old one anymore, so we're going to get rid of that one. And then the minuscule form that they copied it into, that's what goes forward. And so what Van Bruggen is arguing is that the minuscules that we do have were made from the majuscules that the scribes generally trusted. And those majuscules that they generally trusted, they then destroyed. And so what comes down to us of the majuscules that we do have, these are the ones that weren't destroyed, meaning that these are the ones that weren't copied. Van Bruggen argues, and there are some sources that he cites that say this, some experts that he cites that say that this is what the scribes did, that they would copy a manuscript and then destroy it. Destroy the original, that is, not the new one that they just made. That'd be dumb. But they would destroy the original. And so any surviving manuscript that you'd have that hasn't been destroyed is one that wasn't copied because people didn't think it was that good. So all the majuscules that we have that don't match the majority text, well, the reason why we have them is because people didn't think that they were any good. Whereas all the minuscules we have, those were copied from majuscules that people thought were good and then destroyed, and so the majuscule evidence for them isn't anymore, but we have tons of evidence for them in the minuscules. Does that make sense? A little bit of a complicated argument, but basically what he's saying is that the majuscules are not representative because the good ones got destroyed when they were copied. Is that simple enough? Hopefully. All right. And then lastly, Van Bruggen says that the oldest majuscules that we have, like Codex Vaticanus, because remember, Van Bruggen is responding primarily to Hort and all this, because Hort is the first major person to go after the majority text and the traditional text, the Textus Receptus and things like that. So he's primarily responding to Hort, and Hort really liked Codex Vaticanus. And so Van Bruggen, he's of course on the other side, so he's going to respond to this. Okay, so the early critical text guys like Hort were really big fans of Codex Vaticanus, and Van Bruggen steps in and says, no, there's some problems with Vaticanus. These really old majuscules like Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, things like that, he says these ones we can actually show are inferior since they do not possess the majority text readings that are found in some of the more recently discovered papyri. What's the significance of that? Van Bruggen is saying we have these papyri manuscripts that actually do have some majority text readings in them. And in the previous sections, the previous parts of this presentation talking about Van Bruggen, in part 1 and part 2, I actually talked about the fact that we do have some really early papyri manuscripts that do have some particular majority text readings. Now, they themselves are not representative of the majority text, but there's a few readings here and there, a few places, a few sections here and there that are in keeping with the majority text. And so what Van Bruggen is saying is that we have evidence for majority text readings earlier than Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and early majuscules like that. And so what you have with Vaticanus and Sinaiticus is a skipping over of these readings. So you have some of these readings show up early on, you have a blank spot with Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, and then you have these readings continuing further on, because you get some of them in the 5th century and 6th century, so on and so forth. And so Van Bruggen's argument is that these so-called great unsealed manuscripts, great majuscule manuscripts, by the way, unsealed and majuscule basically mean the same thing, that these great majuscule manuscripts are not can't be trusted because they're not even representative of what came immediately before them. Okay, if they were at least in keeping with the papyri that have some majority text readings, then there would be some consistency there, but a lot of these really old majuscules don't have those majority text readings, and so they can't be trusted. All right, so that was Van Bruggen's argument in the third section. He says the critical text proponents, they wrongly rely on the age of the manuscripts to make their argument for them. But really what we should be talking about is not the age of the manuscript, but the age of the text that the manuscript contains. That's what we should be arguing about. And in order to prove that the majority text is actually young, it's not good enough just to say that it comes from mostly young manuscripts. You actually have to prove that the majority text didn't exist early on, and you would have to prove that the early manuscripts that don't have it are actually representative, neither of which you can do. That is Van Bruggen's argument in a nutshell. So let's go ahead and respond to that. So his first point, like we said, is that critical text proponents are wrong because we appeal to the age of manuscripts. And my response to that would be no, we actually believe in consistency. That is, as a general rule, what would you expect of any secular text? Okay, one of the things that I argued for in the very first part of these response videos is that if a standard of truth is a standard of truth, it's going to be a standard of truth always and forever, because God is the God who is sovereign always and forever. He is the God who upholds all things by his power and might. God's standards of truth don't end at one particular line. If it's a standard of truth, it's going to be a standard of truth regardless of the context, if it actually is in fact a standard of truth. So, speaking generally of any secular text, what would we expect? Would we expect that errors in hand-copied manuscripts are going to increase or decrease with time? So if you're making successive copies, and we acknowledge that if you're making hand copies, there's a potential for errors to creep in, what would we expect the directionality of those errors to be? The errors are going to increase with time, or the errors are going to decrease with time? Okay. What would you expect in any other context? If we're not talking about the Bible, okay, what would you expect? If I give you a handwritten essay and I ask you to copy it, and then ask you to give it to someone else and have them copy it, and keep going for 5 or 10 generations, what would you expect? Would you expect that the very last one is going to be better, that 5th or that 10th one is going to be better than the 2nd or 3rd copy? Or would you expect that the 2nd or 3rd copy is going to be better than the 5th copy or the 10th copy? Which would you generally expect to be the case? We are trying to be consistent with how we would treat any other text. And as a general principle, a late copy is generally going to be more prone to having errors than early copies. Now, there are specific exceptions that could be noted, and it's certainly a falsifiable standard. And like I mentioned in my very first response to Van Bruggen, my very first response video, none of the standards that are put forward in text critical circles, at least that I'm aware of, are actually truly absolute standards. That is, all of them can be logically falsified. You can create a situation, at least in the realm of hypotheticals, in which a later copy could in fact be more accurate than an earlier copy. That is hypothetically possible. But the question is that what you would expect in general? And in general, even though there can be specific exceptions, in general, that's not what people would expect. And because of it, our general expectation is going to be that you are much more likely to find the original readings in earlier copies rather than late copies. That doesn't mean that we think that all of the early copies are necessarily high quality copies. but that they have the best probability of presenting the original readings. And this actually is something that coincides with the facts that both sides would agree with. Both sides would agree that the further back in history you go, the more variance you're going to find in the manuscripts. That is, the manuscripts tend to diverge as you go back. They converge as you go forward, they diverge as you go backwards, meaning that as you go forward, you lose readings until it converges on basically the majority text. But if you go backwards, you get a lot more other readings that are a part of it. And the fact that you have so many other readings that are available early on increases the likelihood that the original is going to be one of those available readings. Okay, as you go forward, readings get weeded out. And we talked about this in the second part of this series, where we talked about the converging text issue and the fact that a converging text is one that is eliminating readings. And that's a problem from the critical text point of view, because we want to increase the likelihood that the original is out there, not decrease it. As you go forward in history, the text condenses, it converges, and material gets stripped out of the text tradition as a whole. And so at the end, making a decision as to what's available to you becomes pretty simple. You don't have that much available to you, so decisions tend to be relatively easy. The further back you go, you get a lot more material. In terms of numbers of variants, you don't have as many manuscripts, but the variance that they contain increases. The early manuscripts are much more likely to differ with each other than be similar to each other. So the available number of readings goes up as you go back in time. And what that means is that while it might be harder to make a decision between them, there's a lot higher chance that one of those many readings is going to be true. Later on in the tradition, you might only have two options. It could be this reading or this reading. Sometimes just one reading. This is the only thing that's left, so that's what we're going to go with. Early on, though, you might have 5 or 10 options. It's a lot harder to pick through all of that, but also a lot higher probability that the original is going to be in there somewhere. All right. So, appealing to the age of manuscripts in specific cases, I would agree with Van Bruggen, is something that could be potentially falsified. It's possible to have a later manuscript that is more accurate than a particular early manuscript. But looking at things as from the big picture point of view, from the general expectation, if I'm looking at a category of a bunch of late manuscripts versus a bunch of early manuscripts, which one would I assume is more likely to have the original reading still in it? It's going to be the early one. And like I said, apply it to any other text. Would you generally expect the early copies to be more accurate or the late copies to be more accurate? Taking it as a whole. Yeah, when you compare generations right next to each other, might not be the case. But looking at it over the course of the whole, what would you expect the general trend to be? Take what you would believe there and apply it to the Bible. Standards of truth need to be consistent. All right, and then as to his first supporting point, he says that the age of a manuscript and the age of the text it contains can differ. And that, like I said, is technically true. And in fact, that's actually what CBGM assumes. The coherence-based genealogical method that I've talked about in previous versions, where they're basically feeding all the information into the computer, analyzing manuscripts side by side to try to figure out what all the evidence indicates is actually the best and earliest version of the text. That is actually a basic assumption in CBGM. CBGM assumes that a manuscript and a text are not the same. That in fact you can have late manuscripts that have early texts. That is part of the CBGM system of the way that it does things. It doesn't keep things as manuscripts anymore. Instead it puts things in terms of the text itself, not the manuscript. But even though it does that, what is interesting, though, is that it matches the post-8th century majority text. And I'm saying post-8th century because the 9th century is where the majority text, as we know it, the Byzantine text type, really starts to take off. And CBGM would match that late version of the text that Van Bruggen would be in favor of. It only matches it in 1 out of 130 major variants in the Catholic epistles. CBGM has not analyzed all of the New Testament yet. One area that it has analyzed so far has been the Catholic epistles. There's a few other books as well. But the Catholic epistles, like James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, those are the Catholic epistles. In the Catholic epistles, there's about 130 major variants, and CBGM, which distinguishes between the age of the manuscript and the age of the text, it actually only matches the text that Van Bruggen would prefer 1 out of 130 times. 1 time out of 130, which is different from what it has been in the past. Like I've mentioned in previous response videos, critical text proponents are nowadays a lot more willing to consider majority text type readings than they used to be. But we're also still very evidence driven, and CBGM, this great computerized method where we get to feed all the data into the computer and see what it spits out, has generally, on the whole, sided with the general principle that early copies are much more likely to contain original readings than later copies. Now, there are specific exceptions to that, and in the first response video I talked about that there's a reading, I think it's in 1 Peter 4:16 if I remember right, there's a reading in the Catholic epistles where CBGM indicates that a majority text type reading actually could be, on the basis of all the evidence that was fed into the computer system, actually could legitimately be the original reading. There are some parts of CBGM that I don't agree with just from a mathematic point of view. But like I said, in those earlier versions, the basic principle that a late manuscript can contain earlier readings is something that I do not generally dispute. And CBGM has implemented that practice and has actually agreed with the majority text 1 time out of 130. But we're not against the majority text, or at least against majority text readings, but we want to see how everything fits together, and now, with computer technology being what it is, we actually can do that to a large degree. We're getting a much better picture of how the different parts and pieces of the New Testament textual tradition fit together than we ever had before. And we recognize some of the complaints that our majority text counterparts have put forward, and one of them has been that we don't, at least up to this point, we haven't really been properly distinguishing between manuscript and text and the ages thereof. But like I said, CBGM has changed that, but even at that, the general tendency that early manuscripts tend to have a better likelihood of containing original readings than late manuscripts do has still been upheld. Even though CBGM makes the distinction that the majority texters want us to make, it doesn't drastically change the text from our point of view. Okay, 1 time out of 130, yeah, majority texters have a point here and there, but generally that exception does not disqualify the rule as a whole. Okay, so we are actually making that change, and it's not actually greatly impacting the text. So going with the age of the manuscripts versus going with the age of the text doesn't seem to produce significantly different results. Okay, so it's a fair point, but it doesn't seem to be a very significant point. Van Bruggen went on to say that if you're going to dismiss the majority text, you have to prove that the majority text itself is young, rather than proving that the manuscripts that contain it are young. And my big problem with this, and I mentioned this in earlier versions, not earlier versions, but in earlier responses, my big issue with this is that critical text proponents are not really interested in disproving the majority text. And we've, like I said, we've actually incorporated some majority text readings into our text. We're not against the majority text, at least not nearly as much as we used to be. That's not our question anymore. Our question, the question from people like Horton, early proponents of the critical text, used to be, we've got to get rid of this majority text. We've got to get rid of the Textus Receptus, the traditional text. But nowadays, critical proponents are not asking why the majority text is wrong or why the TR is wrong, the Textus Receptus, that's what the TR refers to. We're not asking why all these things are wrong. We're just asking the question of what was original. And if the question of what was original leads us to the answer that it happens to be a majority text reading in a particular place, then fine. But that's not the way that we approach it. We're not looking for why everything else is wrong. We're looking for what does the evidence tell us is right? What does the evidence tell us is original? And so we apply basic standards, general standards of truth that we would apply in other areas. We accept that these are not absolute standards because they can be logically falsified. I explained this in my first Van Bruggen response video. We understand that they're not absolute, and because of that, we like to use multiple standards whenever we can to reinforce them. But we are looking at general standards that are generally taken to be indicative of what is original, and that's our primary question. We're not interested in decrying the majority text. That's not our point of view. We're not trying to tear down the majority text. We're just simply trying to answer the question of what was original. Okay, we're not against you. Okay, but that's also not our question. Okay, we're not asking why you're wrong. We're asking what is actually right. And they might be related, but they're not the same question. All right, then Van Bruggen goes on to say, well, in the past, proponents of the critical text have appealed to the fact that early church fathers don't mention the majority text. And he disagrees with that standard. And this idea that Van Bruggen is pointing forward, that no pre-Nicene church father cites the majority text, and that doesn't prove that the majority text is young, is basically an argument from silence. He's saying that, the fact that we don't have any evidence from a particular group doesn't necessarily mean that this particular group couldn't have agreed with us. And so my example statement here follows along with that. For example, say that someone said that no records from early European settlers in eastern North America record modern corn. And for those of you guys who don't know, modern corn, American corn, maize, is fairly large. You can get corn cobs that are, easily 7, 8, sometimes 10 or more inches long. They're pretty big. That's what modern corn is. It's a fairly large corn cob. But no early European settlers in eastern North America record this modern huge corn. And so people could argue that non-recording natives, that is, people who didn't leave any records, non-recording natives in western North America could have possessed it. Now, technically, that argument is actually true. Okay. The problem, though, is that this is an argument from silence, and that is not how we would generally consistently do history. That is, generally, we don't argue from what we don't have, we argue from what we do have. And so while it might be technically possible that non-recording natives in western North America could have had the huge modern corn cobs that we have now, the fact is that the records that we do have don't mention it. And so a person who is behaving reasonably and rationally is going to use the evidence that they do have and extrapolate from that. They're not going to extrapolate from what they don't have. So, in the case of corn in early North America, the evidence that we do have says that it wasn't modern corn. It wasn't the really big, huge cobs of corn that we have now. It simply wasn't recorded early on. It's smaller. And in the same way, while Van Bruggen could say, well, the fact that these Egyptian church fathers and these Western church fathers not mentioning the majority text doesn't prove that the Antiochian church fathers, who didn't record anything in this period, could have possessed it. Well, that's technically true. They could have. It's possible. But the question is that actually plausible? For example, in the American system of justice, which I would say is based on biblical principles, not that it is biblical, but based on biblical principles, the standard of conviction is that the prosecution has to have proven their case beyond a plausible doubt. It's not beyond all possible doubt, but it is beyond a plausible doubt. Okay, what's the difference? Well, if the prosecution had to prove their case beyond all possible doubt, they would never be able to prove their case. You have a case where there was a party going on, some kind of a house party, and somebody gets shot at the house party in the upper room, and people only saw the suspect go into the upper room with the victim, and nobody saw anybody else come up or down before or after the victim was shot. Now, is it possible that all of the people at the party could have just missed something? It's possible. But is it really plausible in the situation? If you had people that were fairly observant, if this was a party that did not involve a whole lot of drinking and whatnot, that would impair people's abilities to perceive things, and this wasn't a house that had a secret stairway or something like that, where the entrances and exits were very easy to monitor and people were around these areas, so on and so forth. Is it really plausible? Is it really reasonable that the only suspect that you have really wasn't the true guy who did the wrong thing? No, it's not really plausible. It's not really reasonable. He's the only guy who was in that place at that time. Nobody else went up. Nobody else came down. It's not plausible to say that somebody else was involved. It's not reasonable. Possible, yes. Plausible, no. Same thing here. Okay, all the evidence that we do have from the pre-Nicene Fathers says that they didn't use the majority text. And so what a person who is being consistent in the way that they would handle everything else, they would argue from the evidence that they do have. The evidence that we do have does not include majority text readings from the early church fathers. At least not as a whole. You might have some readings here or there that would match up, but as a whole, there is no pre-Nicene church father who consistently uses a majority text type of text, who uses something that is in what is called the Byzantine text type. There's no pre-Nicene father who does that. And so, if you're going to be reasonable, you argue from what you do have, not what you don't have. Technically, it's possible that in what you don't have could be the thing that disproves it all, but that's not how reasonable people behave and act. Like I said, in the courtroom, if you had to prove beyond all possible doubt, you would never be able to convict anyone. In the case of history, if we're talking about maize, corn, in early North America, the records that we do have says it wasn't the modern corn cobs that we know and love today. Instead, they were much smaller. Those are the only records that we do have. Now, technically, is it possible that someone who didn't record it happened to have modern corn, the large ears of corn? Possible, yes. Plausible? No. It's not a reasonable thing to argue from non-data. No, you argue from what you do have, not what you don't have. Okay, so even the way that Van Bruggen is phrasing this is something that I take issue with. Well, he's saying, yeah, technically the pre-Nicene fathers don't have this, but it's possible that someone in an area that we don't have any records from really did. Well, that's possible, but if you're going to go that way, why not say that it's possible that, they also had working airplanes and helicopters? We don't have any evidence that they didn't, We just have evidence from a bunch of other places that didn't, but maybe not from this one particular place. So maybe they did. It's not really reasonable. We like to make fun of TV programs like Ancient Aliens and series like that do this, that they argue from non-data a lot of times. What's possible that they could have had this, and it's possible that they could have had that. But is it really reasonable? Usually not. Is it really plausible? Not really. We make fun of those, but yet Van Bruggen would have us use basically that same kind of reasoning with regard to the text of the Bible. And as I mentioned in my first Van Bruggen response video, that is not something that Christians should be engaging in. We should believe in the consistency of God's truth to all areas of life. And so if we are going to use the standard of truth of the Bible, of the biblical text that we wouldn't use regarding any other text or of history or of prosecution, etc., etc., if we wouldn't use it in any of these other areas, then it's really hypocritical of us to try to use it on the Bible. All right, and then Van Bruggen points out as supporting evidence of why we shouldn't trust the early church fathers. He mentioned that there's lots of problems with quotations from the early church fathers, and I mentioned them before. Things like the fact that the church fathers are going to paraphrase, that their writings themselves have to come down to us via hand copies, and things can change with hand copies, etc., which is an interesting thing to point out. Van Bruggen recognizes that hand copying can result in errors with the early church fathers, and that later copies can get changed to things that were not original, which is what we argue about the majority text, is that there can be changes along the way that aren't so good. Seems kind of hypocritical for him to point that out, but he admits that. And on the whole, when it comes to all the issues that pertain to the accuracy of the church fathers, critical text proponents generally agree. When we cite evidence for a particular variant, the church father citations are not our primary source. Okay, we consider them to be secondary, at least by the majority of critical text proponents. We treat quotations in the church fathers as secondary, and it's just because we recognize the problems that are associated with them. The church father could have been paraphrasing. The church father's text itself could have been changed by some scribe down the road, etc., etc. There's just all kinds of issues with quotations in the church fathers. And for us, and because of that, for us, it's not our primary datum. It's not a primary source from which we're going to get our data. We do consider it, we do mention it, we do include it in critical versions of the New Testament text, like the UBS 5 is a good example. When you look at the variants in the UBS 5, it will list the manuscript data first, and then after that, it will mention quotations from the early church fathers. But the manuscript data is first, not the church fathers. There's a lot of problems with the church fathers. They're generally considered secondary. And so we would actually agree with Van Bruggen on that one, and because of that, we would be cautious about using them. Van Bruggen went on to say that the extant data is biased towards the least reliable church fathers due to heresy and persecution. He was talking about the Western church fathers and the Egyptian church fathers. And my question sitting back on this is, he does make some fair points that when we look at the early church fathers in the West and in the area around Egypt, there are lots of issues that are associated with them. This was definitely a period of persecution, and it was true that the Romans would go in and they would confiscate Christian manuscripts and then destroy them, often burning them. That's true, and it was true that there were early heresies that were extremely virulent, and that the early heretics would mess with the Bible. That's all true. But my question is, how do you know, or what would be your reason for thinking that the Antiochian fathers that don't record anything for us in this time period, what would be your reason for saying that the Antiochian fathers were somehow immune to all of this? What makes you think that the Antiochian fathers were immune to the influences of these heresies, and they were immune to the effects of persecution, where a lot of manuscripts were getting burned or otherwise destroyed. What makes them immune? Again, this goes back to this issue of, are we going to argue from the data that we do have, which would say that all the places that we do have problems with early heresies and they have problems with persecution, and therefore it is reasonable to assume, based on the evidence that we do have, that this was probably generally true of all Christians. All Christians at the time were dealing with heresies, and all Christians at the time were dealing with persecution. That would seem like that would be the reasonable thing if you're going to argue from the data that you do have. But Van Bruggen seems to like to argue from the data that we don't have. We don't have any data that says that the Antiochian fathers didn't suffer persecution and they didn't suffer from the influence of any heresies. Therefore, they must have been preserved perfect. That's, again, just on its basis, is bad logic. Good logic is that you argue from the data that you do have, not the data that you don't have. But even stepping aside from the data that we do have from that early period, let's go into the next period, when we get into the post-Nicene period, and take a look at these Antiochian Church Fathers and what we have there. And when we get into the post-Nicene period, the Antiochian Fathers don't actually fare all that well. The Antiochian Fathers, to at least some extent, are actually associated with heresies in that next time period. We don't have any early evidence from the Antiochian Fathers, but from the next period that we do get evidence from, it includes heretics. I would suggest that if you're curious about this, that you look up Aetius and Eudoxius of this region. Aetius and Eudoxius of Antioch, I think actually both of them were of Antioch. One of them might have been Constantinople, but still, they're in the Antiochian region. And both of them were heretics. And this is in the period that is immediately following the period in which Van Bruggen is basically assuming that everything was perfect and there were rainbows and no heresy affects us and there's no persecution over here, which we don't have any evidence for. We just don't have any evidence. But the next period that we do have evidence for includes the presence of heretics. So that would seem to say that they weren't immune to heresies. If the people in the early period that we do have records from are talking about persecution and heresies, seems like that would be endemic of pretty much anywhere, because Roman persecution was Roman persecution, so it would be anywhere in the Roman world, and heresy usually doesn't know many bounds. And when we get to the period where we do have history from the Antiochian Fathers, it includes heretics like Aetius and Eudoxius. Seems like they're not immune to this. There's no reason to believe that they're super reliable relative to the Western Fathers and the Egyptian Fathers. And even on top of that, from the evidence that we do have, which what I'm saying is what we should argue from. We should argue from what we do have, not what we don't have. Okay, the records from the early Europeans in North America say there was no modern corn. Okay, yes, it's possible that people who didn't record anything could have had it. Over in Western North America, we could have got some native people that had modern corn who just simply didn't record it. It's possible, but that's not good logic. You reason from what you do have, not from what you don't have. And going back to what we do have concerning some of the early church fathers from other regions like the Egyptian church fathers, because Van Bruggen really doesn't like Egypt. One thing that is important to note about them is that while there are lots of messed up things that happened in Egypt, there are also some really solid things that come out of Egypt. For example, the very first list of the New Testament canon that actually matches what Protestants would accept comes out of Egypt. And it's also important to note that Egypt hosted the major catechetical schools of the time. Van Bruggen points out that, Egypt wasn't the most flourishing Christian spot at the time, and that may be true. But in terms of education, the Egyptian region regarding Christianity was a hotspot. That is very much true. Regarding education, there was a lot of people who were educated by Christians in Egypt. It was a major center of learning, and it became a major center of Christian learning. And so it's not surprising that the first accurate New Testament list that we get is from this major center of early Christian learning. That's where the catechetical schools were, these schools that would teach Christians. Like I said, it might not be the most flourishing in terms of overall population. There might be other places that had a higher number of Christians or a higher proportion of Christians. But in terms of education, all the evidence that we do have indicates that there were a lot of really solid Egyptian Christians that taught really good solid things and came to really good solid conclusions. All right, Van Bruggen is still trying to argue that, we can't let the lack of evidence in the early church fathers dissuade us from the majority text. And he goes on to say that sometimes the fathers followed their own text type, or the same data could be used to argue that they follow either the critical text or the majority text. First, I would like to point out that CBGM, this coherence-based genealogical method that utilizes all the computers and all that stuff, that you feed all the manuscript data into it and all that, it shows that the early sources are just simply diverse. There are no early text types that CBGM has discovered. That is, in days gone by, and a lot of people still talk about it today, but it's kind of going by the wayside. We used to talk about things like the Alexandrian text type and the Western text type and even the Caesarean text type and things like that. But now that we've been looking at these things through computer analysis and being able to get a much better idea of what's actually going on, what we find out is that there are actually no early text types. The early texts are just simply diverse. So Van Bruggen was writing at a time where early text types were still a thing, and people thought that there were such a thing as early text types, and they thought even that the church fathers had their own unique text type. Yeah, CBGM has kind of shown that that's just a bunch of baloney. The early sources just simply differ from one another. They're diverse. They don't have enough uniformity to call any particular set of them a true text type. And then as to the second part of Van Bruggen's argument, that the same data could be used to argue that these church fathers were using the critical text or the majority text, that you could go either way. Well, that really needs to be examined. Okay, in his footnote, in footnote 53, he takes on the analysis of Afrahat. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that, but Afrahat the Persian, who is writing more or less in the early 4th century. And he says that Afrahat's citations could be interpreted as Byzantine, as a part of the Byzantine text type, which is the only true text type. The early texts don't show a text type. The Byzantine text type is the only true text type. And that's what eventually gives us the majority text that Van Bruggen is arguing for. But his argument that Afrahat actually adheres to the Byzantine text is really weak. So Van Bruggen rightly notes that out of 7 relevant citations, okay, when you go through Afrahat's works that have been analyzed so far and that Van Bruggen talks about, I think we've actually done some more work since then, but at the time that Van Bruggen was writing, that there were 7 relevant citations that were under consideration, which isn't a ton, but it's what they had to work with at the time. And he notes that one of them requires reconstruction. That is, that at this particular place, we don't know exactly what Afrahat's reading was, and so the people who are analyzing it initially supplied their own reading. And when you supply your own reading, you can't really say that that is this person's reading because it's a reconstruction. You don't really know. And so I'll grant that to Van Bruggen. This one, we're not sure about, and so I'll give that one to Van Bruggen. We're not sure about that one. That one, we won't count it. And then he goes on to say that 3 of the citations could be considered to be a quotation of the majority text that was just simply condensed. That is, we have 3 places, I think this was specifically in the Gospel of John, 3 places in the Gospel of John where the majority text version of the Gospel of John had simply been abbreviated by Afrahat, is what Van Bruggen is arguing. But here's the problem. that a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, the critical text is actually shorter than the majority text. It depends on exactly what version of each one that you're looking at, but oftentimes they'll differ by 1,000, 2,000 words or so in terms of overall length. The critical text is usually somewhere around 138,000 words. Majority text versions are somewhere around 140,000 words, give or take. And so majority text is generally just a little bit longer than the critical text. And so mechanically speaking, Averhat's quotations are actually closer to the critical text in those cases. Now, could you explain them as being abbreviations of the majority text? You could, but they're actually mechanically closer to the critical text in each one of those cases. Van Bruggen argues that one of these citations could be considered to be an expanded quotation of the majority text, and he's referencing specifically John 6:52 at that point. And in John 6:52, the critical text is actually one word longer. And so mechanically, it is closer to the critical text. Now, you could argue that it's just an expansion of the critical text. Averhat was paraphrasing and he added an extra word, which is technically possible, but still, mechanically speaking, as to what Averhat actually did and which one it actually matches the critical text. And then the remaining two citations that we have in Averhat regarding the Gospel of John, those are certainly Byzantine, and I'm not going to argue with Van Bruggen on that point. So, it's possible that some of these citations were expanded quotations from a majority text type reading or that they were a condensed quotation, but mechanically, Averhat is still closer to the critical text than to the Byzantine text or the majority text. Okay, and specifically in 4 out of 6 cases, not counting the one that requires reconstruction, but in the ones where we actually have a good idea of what Averhat actually said, in 4 out of the 6 cases, Averhat is still mechanically closer to the critical text. You could explain it in other ways, but mechanically it's closer to the critical text. And that, again, is what Van Bruggen keeps going back to. He keeps going, it's possible to explain it this way. It's possible to explain it that way. Possible? Yes. Plausible? Not so much. If you're going to be honest with the evidence and let the evidence direct where you're going, you're not going to try to re-explain it to fit what you want it to be. You're going to accept it as it is. And Averhat is mechanically closer to the critical text than he is to the majority text. Admittedly, there are cases where his readings are in line with the majority text. They are in line with Byzantine-type readings. But he still winds up being closer to the critical text side than to the Byzantine text side, than to the majority text side, mechanically speaking. Okay, it's possible to explain it in other ways, but reasoning from what is possible is not reasonable. Okay? That is not the standard of evidence that you would use in other areas, or at least I hope not. Okay, I really hope that your sense of justice is not that you have to prove that someone is guilty beyond all possible doubt, because then no one is going to get convicted and there is no justice whatsoever that is going to get served. Okay, if we're doing it on the basis of possibility, then there's lots of things that in his story could have been possible. We could have had modern corn being discovered by some Western North America natives who never recorded it, and then it was lost and rediscovered. We could have had, ancient people from the Andes having developed jet fighters and just simply not leaving a record of it. It's possible. Not really plausible, though. Not reasonable. Okay, the vast majority of the people that I know that would be in favor of the majority text would not use that kind of reasoning anywhere else, but when it comes to the text of the New Testament, then that kind of reasoning is suddenly okay. And like I said in my intro to this video, I'm not trying to be mean to Van Bruggen or to people who are on the majority text side. That is not my purpose. I'm simply pointing out that what they're doing is very problematic for someone who claims to follow the God of truth. The God of truth is consistently true, and his truth is consistent across the different areas and aspects of life. And if we don't act in accord with that, then our understanding of God, frankly, isn't the biblical understanding of God. The biblical God is not one whose standards of truth just suddenly change depending on the subject that you're talking about. But that's how majority texters tend to act, unfortunately. All right, and then Van Bruggen's second main point, going on, he's been on this idea that, we can't look too much into what the church fathers say, and here's all the reasons why we might be wrong about them. He says that the earliest Antiochian writings that we do have are in line with the majority text and are not treated as a new text in the writings of the 4th century. So, going from the earliest evidence that we have from the Antiochian fathers, and these are the guys to look at, well, they're on our side. They're majority texters with us. And nobody at the time thought it was weird or strange, and so obviously they weren't introducing something new. Well, we just talked about Aphrahat, which would be in the Antiochian region. He'd be more so on the Constantinople side, but he'd still be in that general region. And Aphrahat, like we said, is mechanically closer to the critical text than he is to the majority text. So, no, the first writings that we get from that region actually are not in keeping with the majority text. They have some Byzantine elements, some elements that would be indicative of the majority text, but on the whole, no. But the bigger issue that I have with this point that Van Bruggen brings up is his assertion that nobody treated these writings as new, that nobody saw these writings as novel. That is something that, on the one hand, isn't true, and I'll get to that in a second, but the basic reasoning behind it isn't very good either. That is, first you need to understand that the amount of difference that we're talking about here is actually pretty small. The majority text of the New Testament and the critical text of the New Testament don't differ very much. And in terms of substantial differences, it's less than 5%. A lot of people would say smaller than that. I'm estimating on the high side. But definitely less than 5%, meaning that 95% of the time they are exactly the same. So were there any substantial number of people in the 4th century who noticed that these Antiochian guys are using a different text? Well, not really, but at the same time, would you expect them to? If it's only a 5% difference, there's not a lot to notice in the first place. So is this a reasonable point? Is this actually a point that's worthwhile bringing up? Is this a merit-worthy point? Not really. Saying that people didn't notice something that's hard to notice doesn't really prove anything. Another point that goes along with that is the way that the New Testament text was viewed at the time. The early church fathers didn't have Bibles like we do. We're very lucky in the modern age in that we have complete Bibles bound in one single cover. You can go from cover to cover and you can get the entire Bible right there at your fingertips. Early church fathers, by and large, did not have that. Complete texts of the Bible were extremely rare. And even getting complete bindings of the New Testament were extremely rare. In fact, out of the roughly 6,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts that we have, only about 60 of them are relatively complete New Testament texts that actually, have the Gospels in them, and the Catholic epistles in them, and the Pauline epistles in them, and Acts in them, and Revelation. Very few of them actually have all those in them, or at least originally had all of them in them. There's only about 60 of them that were relatively complete New Testament texts that were actually meant to be compilations of the entire New Testament. Only 1%, basically. 60 out of 6,000. The rest of the New Testament manuscripts that we have are not entire New Testaments, let alone entire Bibles. Most of them are collections of a few books. So here's a collection of the Gospels. Here's a collection of the Pauline corpus. Here's a collection of the Catholic epistles. Revelation is usually off on its own. They did not tend to view the New Testament as a whole. It was a bunch of different books that would be laying around that they all categorized as the New Testament, but they didn't think of it as one volume like we do. And because of that, they're not going to see people introducing a brand new New Testament text if there was any change that was going to occur. Instead, what they're going to notice is specific variants in specific books. And what's actually interesting is that there actually are church fathers who did that. Are they going to accuse the Antiochans of introducing new readings altogether? A completely new text? No, because they didn't view the text as a whole. But in particular books at particular points, they have the possibility of saying, hey, there's some differences here. And that actually did happen. So, while it is true that no early church father accused the Antiochans of inventing a completely brand new New Testament text, it is true that they did actually notice some differences at specific points, because that's how they viewed the text. They didn't view it as one compiled whole, they viewed it as a bunch of separate texts. And they actually did notice some of those differences. For example, Jerome and Eusebius both note the differences that occur regarding the long ending of the Gospel of Mark. And especially Eusebius is very clear about the fact that the long ending of Mark is not at all common in his time and place. And in fact, in the Eusebian canon tables, which break apart they don't break apart the Gospels, but the Eusebian canon tables are basically an organizational schema for the Gospels that help people find related accounts in the Gospels. The Gospels cover a lot of the same material. They're, of course, talking about the life and ministry of Jesus, and there's things that they have in common. And the Eusebian canon tables will give little numbers to the different sections in the Gospels, and there's a table that Eusebius created, as far as we can tell it was Eusebius, that Eusebius created, that would say, okay, all these numbers go together, all these numbers go together, all these numbers go together. These are talking about similar parts of Jesus' life, so on and so forth. And in the Eusebian canon tables that talk about all the different parts of the Gospels, one part of the Gospel of Mark is noticeably missing from his canon tables. And that is the long ending of Mark. As far as Eusebius was concerned, long ending of the Gospel of Mark was not original at all. It was not worth putting in the canon tables. And then you have even other church fathers who might not be overly reliable on a great many things. Origen was a weird dude. But Origen did talk about textual variants, and I wouldn't say that he's necessarily the meet-all be-all, or any particular church father by themselves is the meet-all be-all of things, just because they're all individuals, sometimes willy-nilly in the way that they treat the text, and Origen was definitely that way. But even Origen at the time notes that there are variants, and he also notes what is common at his time. For example, in John 1:28, he notices that the most common reading in his time and place is the one that is accepted by the critical texters, and he notes that the one that is accepted by the majority texters was actually less common in his time. Now, if I remember, I think he actually was in favor of the majority texters, but he does notice the difference. And there are a lot of early church fathers who did notice specific differences at specific points. Okay, they're not going to accuse the Antiochans of introducing a brand new New Testament text, because that's not how they saw the text. They saw the text as parts. And the amount of difference that we're talking about is relatively slight. As far as substantial differences are concerned, it's definitely less than 5%. Probably even less than that. But being generous, 5%. That's not a whole lot of difference. So people aren't going to be accusing people of coming up with brand new New Testament texts, but they are going to notice individual variants, and there's a lot of church fathers who do. And then the very last thing that needs to be pointed out here is that Van Bruggen, in the last section that we talked about in my last response video, he already admitted that the majority text is a convergent text. What is a convergent text? A convergent text is something that over time converges. Van Bruggen already admitted this. This was not an immediate change. This is something that occurred over time. That's what a convergent text does. And so it wasn't like the majority text appeared suddenly on the scene, even according to Van Bruggen's schema. And if it doesn't suddenly appear on the scene, people aren't going to notice it. It was a set of slow, gradual shifts that occurred over time that led to the production of this text and the proliferation of this text. It's not something that's going to be immediately noticeable. It's not a huge sudden shift. It's progressive, and it occurs in pieces and parts. And the New Testament itself was viewed in pieces and parts. Here's the Gospels, here's the Pauline epistles, here's Acts, here's Revelation, here's the Catholic epistles, so on and so forth. They didn't view it as a whole, relatively small number of differences in the first place. And to say that nobody treated these writings as new isn't the case. There were early church fathers who did notice individual variants and did notice that what was the majority had been replaced with something new. So this one's just kind of a fail on Van Bruggen's part. All right, and then last, for this particular point, he still has his other points, but last on this particular point, he says that it is probable that the Antiochian church had one of the earliest and best libraries of Christian writings, since it was founded early on and was a missionary base used by Paul and Barnabas. Hence, the earliest writings that we do have from it are more likely to be representative of the ancient New Testament than early writings from other places. And this just goes into the mythos that a lot of these people have, whether the people be KJV onlyists or majority text onlyists or canonical or confessional texters or canonical texters. I've heard them go by that as well. All of these people who are on this side all have this idea that Antioch is this great, fantastic, wonderful place. You know, all these other places, they were just wonky and weird, and Antioch is the one golden gem that stands above everything else, and it's so awesome. And I'm just sitting back here saying, you know, for being consistent about things, there isn't really a good reason to prefer Antioch above these other ones. I mean, if Antioch had such great New Testament knowledge, and I've already mentioned this, but if Antioch had such great New Testament knowledge, then why is it that the first accurate New Testament canon list comes from Athanasius of Alexandria, Egypt? That was the first person to accurately list the New Testament as we have it today. An Egyptian father, not an Antiochian father. And by the way, Athanasius is known in history by the phrase Athanasius contra mundum. That's what the little CM stands for, is contra mundum. What is that a reference to? It is a reference to the fact that in the 4th century, when the great Trinitarian debate happened with the Arians, Athanasius kind of more or less stood alone. Not that he was completely alone, but as far as being the most vocal voice of the time, it was him. He was the one who was defending the doctrine of the Trinity against the Arians more so than anybody else at the time. Not to say that there weren't other people who were with him, or everybody else everywhere were all heretics, but Athanasius was the one that really took the bull by the horns and was really doing his very best to lead the world back to the biblical doctrine of God, to an understanding of the Trinity. And that's how we honor him in history, is by that phrase, Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. It was the case that at least at certain points in his life, where pretty much everyone was against him. And this included a lot of people in the Antiochian region as well. Okay. And then on top of that, so we have the first accurate understanding of the New Testament canon list comes from Egypt. We have the best understanding, most solid understanding of who God is coming out of Egypt. We also have some really bad understandings of God that come out of Egypt too. But the staunchest defender of the doctrine of God, the Trinitarian doctrine of God, also comes out of Egypt. And then another interesting thing is that early on, the Alexandrian Sea of Christianity, a Sea of Christianity is basically a place of authority and influence. And early on, there were 4 major seas. 5th one, Constantinople, got added on later. But there were 4 great seas early on. There was Jerusalem, That one should be fairly obvious as to why there was Jerusalem. There was Jerusalem, there was Alexandria, there was Antioch, and there was Rome. Those were the four great sees of Christianity. And what's interesting is that Alexandria, the Alexandrian See, was the one that had the privilege of deciding the date of Easter for all of Christendom. That was a privilege that was afforded to it and not to anybody else. Why? Well, that goes back to what I said previously, that the Egyptian area of Christianity was basically the intellectual center of Christianity. They were the ones who had the best understanding of what the canon was. They were the ones who had the best understanding of what the text actually taught. It actually taught the Trinity and not Arianism. They also had the best understanding of the Christian holidays like Easter. And then another problem that I have with this is the whole Antioch is great and everybody else is bad. This part of this basis is this whole idea that, Antioch is founded early on by biblical figures, and therefore that means that it's special and nothing bad can happen there. Well, frankly, the historical record says that all of the other major sees, the other three major sees, were also established by biblical figures. That is, Jerusalem, the See of Jerusalem, was founded by Peter and James. Alexandria was founded by Mark the Evangelist, and Rome was, of course, founded by Peter and Paul. These are all biblical figures as well. Why not trust the manuscripts that come from them? All the evidence that we have says that these sees are indeed very ancient, established by biblical figures, people who were going on missionary journeys. Why wouldn't these people also be interested in the correct text? What makes them so inherently worse? They are, substantially speaking, just as ancient as Antioch. Okay, at least within, a few decades. Antioch was, probably one of the earlier ones that was established, but they're all within the lifetime of the biblical figures in the New Testament. I mean, we're talking 10, 20, maybe 30 years maximum difference between them. There's no substantial reason for thinking that 30 years head start at max is going to result in a great difference in doctrinal accuracy or inaccuracy. Or, there's no reason to treat Antioch as this magical place where everything was perfect and good. But, Alexandria and Jerusalem and Rome, they can just go suck drool. Because they were just totally awful. No, there's no reason for believing that. Okay, what Van Bruggen is doing is what a friend of mine likes to call a theory tale. That is, you have a set of historical facts and you create a scenario to explain them. And the scenario that you create sometimes doesn't have any more merit than a fairy tale does. And that's why my friend calls them fairy tales. This is the theory that explains it, but it's kind of like a fairy tale. That's what Van Bruggen is doing here. He's created a theory tale, which is pretty much a fairy tale, about how great and pure Antioch was. And the same kinds of things that he says about Antioch and that he hypothesizes about Antioch could be said of Rome, and it could be said of Alexandria, and it could be said of Jerusalem. Why those ones don't get any credits, I don't know. Is there any consistent reason to discredit those ones while elevating Antioch to an elevated state? Nope. Nothing but a theory tale. More accurately, a fairy tale. And like I said, it doesn't matter who it is that's against the critical text on this one. If it be a majority texter, or a Textus Receptus defender, or a KJV onlyist, or a canonical texter, or an ecclesiastical texter, whoever it happens to be who doesn't like the critical text of the New Testament, pretty much all of them have this grandiose idea of Antioch. And like I said, the kinds of things that they say about Antioch are not substantially different from what could be said about the other great sees of ancient Christianity. These other great sees were also founded by biblical figures as far as we can tell in history. Okay, like I said, Peter and Paul associated with Rome. Mark the Evangelist associated with Alexandria. Peter and James associated with Jerusalem. Why are Paul and Barnabas so special? Because they had early missionary work, and you'd think that these other groups didn't do any missionary work? There's just no consistency here, and that's, again, the major theme throughout all of this, is the way that you're reasoning here consistent with how you would reason elsewhere. And what you say here, could it be consistently said of other places as well? Yes, it could. Okay, there's no reason to elevate Antioch like this, but that is what all of these people do. Hey, Antioch is perfect and wonderful. You know, it's fantastic. Really great theory tale. But, like I said, you can make the same arguments about other places. And if you're, for example, a Roman Catholic, you'll argue the same thing about Rome. Oh, it was founded by Peter and Paul, you know, the great missionary, and also the first apostle. I mean, that's got to count for something. He was the leader of the apostles, and so we really need to trust the Roman See over the Antiochian See. And if you know anything about this split between East and West, you know that's exactly where they went with that. It's just so easy to take these arguments and flip them around and put the emphasis in different areas. And if you can do that, it's probably a really good indication that you really shouldn't use that kind of argumentation. Just saying. All right, and then we get into Van Bruggen's third main point, and that is that the extant early manuscripts are not representative of their time. Okay. That's what he tries to argue. Now, we shouldn't use the early manuscripts because they're not really representative. And again, this goes back to that whole issue of reasoning from what we don't have. Van Bruggen is saying that, you know, it's possible that there were other better manuscripts that existed at these times and places, and they could have read with the majority text. We don't have any evidence that is the case, that majority text manuscripts were actually in the majority early on. Technically possible, but we don't have any actual evidence of that, and so again, he's reasoning from what we don't have. And this is something that I would not see majority text advocates doing in any other area. For example, if you're dealing with a Mormon who's talking about the Book of Mormon, nowadays they like to be called Latter-day Saints and all that kind of thing, or members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But if you're talking with them about the Book of Mormon and talking about them to them about the standard of accuracy, you know, say, how do we know that the Book of Mormon was correctly translated? Because the Book of Mormon is supposedly translated from a Reformed Egyptian manuscript that was written on golden leaves, basically golden pages. And so, golden tablets, whatever you want to call it. How do we know that it's translated accurately from those? And conveniently for Mormons, the original Book of Mormon in Reformed Egyptian was supposedly taken back up into heaven by the angel Moroni. And so we don't have any original language version of the Book of Mormon anymore, if we ever did, and I would argue that we didn't. But as far as accuracy is concerned, the Book of Mormon, you cannot verify its accuracy because there's no original language manuscript that we have to check it on it. The evidence that we do have from Joseph Smith is that he could not translate ancient languages. We have, for example, another document that the Mormons use that is called the Book of Abraham, and Joseph Smith supposedly translated that from an Egyptian manuscript that the church came into possession of, and we actually still have that manuscript. That manuscript still exists. And it turns out that Joseph Smith's translation and the original document don't have really anything in common. The Egyptian manuscript is a funerary document, a very common funerary document that doesn't have anything to do with Abraham. But Joseph Smith thought it did, and he made a really interesting story about Abraham from it, but not at all accurate. And so the evidence that we do have says that Joseph Smith couldn't translate ancient languages. But a lot of Mormons will say, well, maybe there was some funny stuff going on with the Book of Abraham and all that. But we don't have the original version of the Book of Mormon, the original, version in Reformed Egyptian. We don't have that anymore, and so you can't prove that the Book of Mormon was incorrectly translated. Would you accept that kind of reasoning from a Mormon? The evidence that we do have from the Book of Abraham says that Joseph Smith couldn't translate dead languages. But on the basis of non-evidence, the fact that we don't have the supposedly reformed Egyptian golden tablets from which the Book of Mormon was translated, on the basis of not having that, is it then okay to assert that the Book of Mormon, that one was translated accurately? No, that's ridiculous. You're arguing from what you don't have. Same thing with the Quran. The Quran, historically, we know that the Quran that we have today was the result of an official recension that was carried out under the third rightly guided Caliph Uthman, who basically commissioned an official version of the text and then burned everything that was before it. And Muslims would say that this version of the Quran is accurate because it's the official version that was put out by Caliph Uthman. Well, there's also some stuff that happened later on in history as well, but substantially going back to Uthman. And our question would be, well, how do you know it's accurate? Do you have any earlier versions that it would happen to agree with? Well, they were all burned. Well, there's a few manuscripts here and there that may have survived and that don't actually match the modern version of the Quran. But most of the material was destroyed, and so there you don't really have anything to compare it to. And so on the basis of non-evidence, we don't know what the early versions of the Quran said, therefore this one must be correct. What? How is that accurate? It's not. That's arguing from what you don't have. You want to accept it with the Mormons regarding the Book of Mormon, saying, well, we don't have the original Reformed Egyptian text, and therefore it's possible that Joseph Smith got it right. Same thing with the Muslims. We wouldn't accept it from them. We don't have any substantial number of any pre-Uthmanic versions of the Quran. Therefore, the Uthmanic version of the Quran could be correct. We wouldn't accept that as good reasoning from them. Why would we accept it as good reasoning when it comes to Van Bruggen and his understanding of the New Testament text? Perhaps there were manuscripts that existed at the time, a lot more manuscripts that existed at the time that were really in favor of the majority text, but they just didn't survive, is basically what Van Bruggen is arguing for. Again, that's an argument from non-evidence. And he goes through them, particularly by classification. And he first goes to the papyri and says, well, our first problem with the papyri is they only come from Egypt, and they're probably not the best copies that come from Egypt. And he does cite some experts to this effect, that speak about the fact that, this is only from Egypt and therefore probably not representative of what is going on in the world as a whole. And they're also probably not the best copies that were available in Egypt. And there are experts that you can cite to that effect. But one of the things that comes into play with experts is that you can generally find an expert somewhere who will say just about anything. You can find experts for almost any point that you want to make. And so one of the real big questions that needs to come up with when you're talking about experts is whether or not these experts can actually provide any kind of substantial evidence. If they can actually point to say something and say, this is an example of what I'm talking about. This is why I'm saying this. Van Bruggen, when he cited his experts, they weren't able to provide substantial evidence to that effect. But let me show you an expert on the other side who actually does. This is a quote from Philip Comfort, writing in 1990 in his book Early Manuscripts and Modern Translations of the New Testament, page 11. He says, all the material that he's discussed up to this point, all this tells us that the New Testament papyri discovered in this part of the world, meaning Egypt, present a fair sampling of what might be found in early papyri all over the world. Okay, so that's the claim that stands in juxtaposition to Van Bruggen. Van Bruggen, he cites his experts to say that, these are just from Egypt and they're not representative of the whole world. Here's another expert who's saying the exact opposite. Yeah, they're just from Egypt, but they are representative of what's found all over the world. But he does something that Van Bruggen's experts don't do. He goes on to provide a specific example. He says the 3rd century New Testament manuscript P13, discovered in Oxyrhynchus, is a prime example of a transported New Testament manuscript. That is, everybody likes to say, well, they're just found in Egypt and they're not representative of what was going on in the rest of the world. And Comfort comes in and says, no, they are representative of what was going on in the rest of the world. And here's an example of one that actually does come from another part of the world. Manuscript P13 comes from Rome. It was not made in Egypt. And then further on, Comfort goes on to point this out, and you can find this data in other places, so I'm not going to specifically attribute it to Comfort, but you can find it in Comfort. He goes on to point out that not only is there direct evidence, or at least substantial evidence, that manuscripts were coming into Egypt, but he also points out that a lot of the papyri that we have from early Egypt, the early papyri manuscripts, a lot of their readings wind up showing up in manuscripts that are found in other places in the world. For example, manuscript P75, which again is an Egyptian papyri, all of the papyri that we have today are Egyptian papyri, he points out that the readings that it has wind up showing up in manuscript B, which was discovered, at least as far as modern Providence is concerned, in Rome. We don't know where it was before that, but this is the readings from P75 from this Egyptian manuscript wind up in Rome. Manuscript P18, another Egyptian manuscript, but its readings wind up showing up in manuscript C, which as far as modern Providence is concerned was discovered in Constantinople. And then the Egyptian manuscript, papyri manuscript P46, has readings that show up in manuscript 1739, which was found on Mount Athos in Greece. So what we have, as far as the actual evidence is concerned, is manuscripts that were brought into Egypt, like P13 that Comfort talks about, and readings that show up in other manuscripts that actually we first see in the Egyptian manuscripts. So we have readings and manuscripts coming into Egypt, and we have evidence that at least the readings, if not the manuscripts themselves, made it out of Egypt. And what this means, as Comfort rightly says, is that Egypt actually does represent a fair sampling of papyri from all over the world. We have evidence that papyri from other places in the world were coming into Egypt, and that the Egyptian readings, at least, were going out into the rest of the world as well. Now, are they going to be perfectly representative? I don't know any critical text proponent that would argue that they're perfectly representative. And then as to the point that these texts are not the highest quality texts on the face of the planet, these were not the pristine library copies or the pristine church copies, that's fair. But from a critical text perspective, our issue isn't so much the quality of the manuscripts, but the diversity of the manuscripts. If you have good diversity, you have an increased chance that the original reading is going to be found in that diversity. The more diverse the witnesses are, the higher the probability that the original is going to be found. If an individual manuscript or even a lot of individual manuscripts aren't super high quality, that's not that big of an issue. Okay, there are text critical principles that you can apply that will help weed out a lot of those inconsistencies. But the big thing to have is a wide enough body of material that you have a good chance of getting the originals somewhere in there. The early papyri sometimes don't agree with each other very much. They're not overly consistent. But the fact that they're not overly consistent is a good thing. It means that one of them is more likely than not to have the original reading. Might not be all of them, but given how much diversity there is, there's a good chance that at least one of them does. And so every thing that we have indicates that there is a plenteous amount of variety there. You're just looking at the papyri by themselves, you can get that. And then we look at where these papyri come from. Ones like P13 actually come from Rome. And then some of these papyri wound up seemingly influencing or at least having readings in common with other manuscripts that wind up all over the world. There's a good variety there. And that's what critical text proponents want to see. We want to see good variety, and the papyri do have that. And we have good, solid evidence that we can point to that say that, yes, there is a good variety here that is representative of what was going on in other places of the world. It might not be perfectly representative, but more representative than not. Okay, again, that's arguing from what you do have rather than what you don't have. Okay, and like I said, Comfort, our expert on this side, actually was able to provide specific data to back up his claim. Van Bruggen's folks, not so much. Their data was kind of non-data. Okay. Not to say that there isn't, a list of quotations that he could provide from various people, but as far as actually being able to point out and deal with specific manuscripts and whatnot, they don't do that. They just argue in generalities about why this isn't so good or why this isn't so bad. The critical text people, though, we actually can point to specific manuscripts that came from specific places and wound up influencing other ones. We actually are the ones that have the hard data and not just the theory tales. All right, and then Van Bruggen goes on to talk about the major schools. And his major argument with the major schools is that scribes would destroy manuscripts after copying them. And so the scribes are going to copy the best manuscripts they can, and then of course they're going to destroy them. And so the only manuscripts that survive are the bad ones. And again, Van Bruggen cites some people that say that this is the case. But these people that argue that this is the case, and you can look through his footnotes, look through their material. None of them will cite any primary sources to this effect. These people are people who are looking at the body of manuscripts that we have, and they are theorizing that this is how we explain the data. But none of them can actually point to a primary source that actually ever says that the habit of the scribes was to destroy a manuscript after it was copied. There is not a single primary source in the entire world that I'm aware of that actually says that. There are a lot of secondary and tertiary sources that say that, a lot of people that have theorized that based on the manuscript evidence. But as far as an actual historical source where we actually have a record of a scribe saying, I got done copying the manuscript and so I burned it or something like that, doesn't happen. Where an early church father is describing the practices of the local scriptorium and saying, oh yeah, we always burn all the originals after we get done copying them. There is no original source material out there like that. Not a one. No original source material that says that it was actually the habit of the scribes to destroy their originals. Exemplars were not, at least according to the historical data that we do have. There is no historical data to back up the idea that manuscripts were destroyed immediately after transcription. No primary source material whatsoever. A lot of theory tales, but no primary source material whatsoever. And then to add insult to injury, not only is there no primary sources that actually say what Van Bruggen is arguing for, but we actually have hard data to the contrary. That is, we have New Testament manuscripts that actually have extant exemplars. That is, we have both the copies and what they were copied from. If Van Bruggen was right that it was the habit of the scribes to destroy these manuscripts after copying them, we shouldn't have that. We shouldn't have any copies with their originals. But that's actually what we do have. And I give a couple of instances here. This is not meant to be exhaustive, but it is sufficient for my point. Manuscripts 0319 and 0320 were copied from manuscript 06. And likewise, manuscript 821 was copied from manuscript 0141. We know this. Okay, these are manuscripts that we actually have good auxiliary records of. A lot of times, scribes didn't say what manuscript they were copying and so on and so forth. But this is a case where we actually have identification of what they were copying, and so we know what the exemplar was and what the copies were, and we have both. They didn't immediately destroy it. And what's interesting is how these copies wound up going. 06 is a 5th century manuscript, and what's interesting about it is that it's a Western manuscript, and it gets copied in the 9th and 10th centuries, and it has a lot of readings that frankly are not in keeping with the modern majority text. And according to Van Bruggen, the scribes were deselecting these bad manuscripts. They didn't want these ones that weren't majority text, because they understood that the majority text was right, and so they're not going to pick one of the bad manuscripts to copy. Well, this is a manuscript that was not a majority text manuscript, and it got copied, and it didn't get copied just once but twice. In the 9th century, one guy copies it, and if Van Bruggen is right, they should have destroyed it right then. But no, they kept it around, and it got copied again, and was still kept around. So this is a manuscript that could have been destroyed twice, and it was kept around. In the case of 821, again, it was one that was copied from an earlier manuscript. It was copied from a 10th century manuscript. And 0141 isn't non-Byzantine, but it isn't a true majority text manuscript either. It doesn't have, for example, John 5:4 or the woman caught in adultery. It's not a true majority text manuscript in that regard, but it does have a lot of Byzantine readings, but still not true majority text, and still it gets copied. And it gets copied pretty late, over in the 16th century. If what Van Bruggen is saying is true, that the scribes were intentionally staying away from these bad manuscripts, well, you can understand maybe someone in the 9th or the 10th century where this transition is supposedly happening. That's what Van Bruggen says. In the 9th century, when they developed the minuscule script, that's when people decided, oh yeah, we got to go back to get the good stuff. And a lot of the ones that we have where they went back, they didn't get the good stuff according to Van Bruggen. They got 06, which is not a majority text manuscript. They got 0141, which is not a true majority text manuscript. It's in the Byzantine family, but still not true majority text. So a little bit of a problem there. So that whole thing about they just always destroy the exemplars, not true, and that they were going for manuscripts that were like the majority text, also not really true either. Okay, now granted, like I said, that list of copies and originals is not meant to be exhaustive, just sufficient to my point. Okay. And then it also needs to be said that Van Bruggen's post-3rd century recovery, we talked about in previous parts, that Van Bruggen supposes that after the 3rd century, when you get into the 4th century and Christianity is made a legal religion, he supposes that people went around and recovering all the different manuscripts at that time, and they got them back together and said, okay, now that Christianity is legal, we don't have to hide in the shadows, and we can all come together and get the text figured out that's been in disarray for forever, well, for the past few centuries. That idea, and now the idea that he puts forward in this century, that after the 8th century, that people were only transcribing the good text, once we get into the 9th century with the minuscule text and all that, these hypotheses that Van Bruggen comes up with require an ascription of specific motives to the scribes that cannot be confirmed. That is, in each of these cases, he's supposing that people got together with the specific intent of, oh, we need to recover the original text again. It's been in disarray for a little while now, and we need to go back and get it, or we need to make sure that we're only copying the good ones, not the others. And this is stuff that you can't confirm. There's nowhere in history where a scribe sits down and says, okay, we all agree that in our new minuscule text, we're only going to be copying the good ones, not the bad ones. Or now that things are peaceful, we're going to go back and we're going to recover the original text that's been in disarray for the past couple centuries. There's nothing in history that actually directly confirms this. There's no primary source material. That's Van Bruggen's side. That's his hypotheses. Critical text opponents, though, like myself, explain the manuscript data via the available history. And this is something that I went over in the second Van Bruggen response. I talked about the fact that there is a set of historical circumstances that led to the region around Antioch and Byzantium being the only region left producing Greek manuscripts. The way that we explain that the majority text became the majority text is through what happened in history. We don't explain it in terms of what the scribes might have been wanting to do. We don't know what the scribes wanted to do. We can't read their minds from hundreds and thousands of years later. Okay, I can't do a long-range psychoanalysis of anyone. I don't know what other people are thinking. People right next to me in my own time, I don't know, let alone someone 100 or 200 or 500 or 1,000 plus years ago. I can't do that. It's not reasonable for me to assume that I can. That I can ascribe motives to people that I don't know, and motives to people who never stated what their motives were. We don't have any direct evidence that this is what the scribes were doing. That in the 4th century, when Christianity became legal, they all got together and said, okay guys, we all know that the manuscripts that we have available to us right now are bad, and so we need to go through and we need to look for the most ancient forms of the text we can and recompile those. There's no evidence that that ever happened. And in the post-8th century period, going into the 9th century and later, there's no evidence that the scribes said, well, you guys make sure that you know that you're copying the good manuscripts and not the bad ones. Okay, you need to test your manuscripts before you copy them. There's no evidence that any of them ever said anything like that. They copied what they had, and in certain cases they copied what they had multiple times, and the evidence that we do have suggests that they were not in the habit of destroying their manuscripts. And when you think about it, that's just a really, I'm not trying to be mean. Okay, I understand that there are a lot of people on this side of the issue that are very sincere in what they believe, but they happen to be sincerely wrong. And frankly, it is really a ridiculous proposal to think that after you just copied the Word of God, that you're going to take the original manuscript and you're going to destroy it. Okay, I made the copy for so-and-so who wanted a copy, I'm going to torch the original. Think about that in the context of early Christians, okay, or just Christianity in general. You would have places that would be sending out missionaries, and these missionaries would oftentimes want copies of the Bible to take with them, or at least their particular books, and setting up different churches in different regions. You know, they usually come out of one particular place. One place that had a scriptorium would wind up providing manuscripts for all the local churches. If you keep torching your original every time that you make one, you don't have your original anymore. That everything that we have indicates that that wasn't the practice. Instead, they would make a copy from it. And then another church would come through needing copies, and they would make copies again, and copies again, and copies again. There was no concerted effort to try to minimize the influence of these manuscripts while increase the influence of these other ones. It just wasn't a thing. Most scribes were not thinking in terms of textual families or any of those kinds of things. They worked with what they had. And our belief as critical text proponents is that the majority of scribes were trying to do a good job with what they had. And there was no nefarious intentions or anything like that. They were just trying to do the best with what they had. And beyond that, we really don't know anything about them, and so we don't suppose that this was their intention in the 4th century and this was what their practice was in the 9th century, because we don't know. They didn't say. Again, critical text proponents like to reason from what we do have, not what we don't have. That's one of our major problems with majority texters, is they really like to argue from what we don't have. We don't have anything that says that the scribes didn't try to recover the text in the 4th century, or that they had a limited transcription policy in the 9th century and afterwards. We don't have anything that says that. It's possible that they did, but it's not plausible. Possible, yes. Plausible, that is reasonable, no. Okay. Critical text proponents like to reason from the evidence that we do have, not the evidence that we don't have. Okay, there are historical reasons for why the Byzantine text winds up being the majority. I explained that in part 2. If you're curious about that, look that up. Okay, but again, we reason from the evidence that we do have, not from a theory tale about what could have possibly happened or could have possibly been someone's motivations. We don't know. So we don't know. All right, and then last but not least, Van Bruggen specifically takes a shot at Codex Vaticanus. He takes a specific shot at the really old majuscules like Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, Ephraemi Rescriptus, things like that. And he says that they're shown to be inferior on the basis that they don't possess the majority text readings that some of the papyri have. Okay, and here is where one of those places where Van Bruggen's argument is kind of irrelevant. He's responding to Hort, and frankly, textual criticism has progressed since Hort. Hort did have an overemphasis on manuscripts like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, whereas a lot of modern critical text proponents would recognize that, you know, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and Ephraemi Rescriptus and manuscripts like that probably weren't perfect. And because of that, we need to be a little bit more holistic in how we view the data, including those papyri that do in fact have some majority text readings. And even the majority text itself can have early readings, even if it doesn't show up in early papyri, which is what CBGM assumes and all that. And I've talked about that. So this particular argument here isn't really all that relevant, and we actually kind of agree with Van Bruggen on this one. There were proponents of the critical text early on who really emphasized Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. We don't do that anymore. Okay, so it's not really that big of an issue here. But again, in Van Bruggen's vitriol against the critical text, he goes on to create more theory tales that just really aren't substantiable. Van Bruggen even goes on to say that, you know, from the period of the papyri going into these really old majuscules like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, he proposes that there was some kind of de-Byzantining of the text that went on. You know, there's the papyri, which have a few Byzantine readings here and there, and then the really old majuscules pretty much don't have any Byzantine readings in them. And then we get into a later period where the Byzantine text becomes dominant. And so Van Bruggen is looking at this and he says, you know, there's a little bit here, then it goes down, and then it goes up again. Oh, there's this period where they were de-Byzantining the text. They were trying to get rid of those wonderful readings that we all know to be true. Well, this is where we would look at that and we'd say, yes, there is a little bit of a dip there, but it is really a tiny dip. Okay, it's not like every single papyri has, it has at least 10% Byzantine readings or something like that. You're talking about individual verses or individual passages here and there. It is very, very, very minute. So what we actually see in the real data is a little bit of Byzantine readings, just a little smidge, less of a smidge, and then more or less slow and steady growth. And so for us, it's just a little blip. We don't see it as this concerted effort on the part of the scribes to get rid of things. And even if you look at manuscripts that are relatively contemporaneous with Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, there are manuscripts in the same time period that will have Byzantine type readings in them. Like Codex Alexandrinus, for example, is within a century or so of Vaticanus, and it does have very distinct Byzantine readings, at least in the Gospels. So it's not like it completely falls out of prevalence in the history. No. Instead, you have, like I said, a little smidge. There are a few manuscripts in between that don't really have anything, and then more or less slow and steady growth afterwards. It's not like there is any evidence of this great turnaround where people were trying to get rid of all these Byzantine readings and then eventually they brought them back. Again, Van Bruggen likes to theorize about what people's intentions were, where there is no evidence that these people actually did this. There's no evidence that these people actually ever said that they were de-Byzantining the text or that they were re-Byzantining the text afterwards. Okay, he's trying to explain the data that he thinks is there, but he really overestimates the significance of it. It's not like all of our early evidence has tons of Byzantine readings. then it falls off at Vaticanus and then climbs back afterwards. No, it's very few majority text readings, or readings that would coincide with the majority text. Very few. A few less than some of the intermediate manuscripts, and then slow and steady growth thereafter. There's no good reason for proposing some kind of a conspiracy where people were trying to run around and de-Byzantine the text in the first couple of centuries. Okay, like I said, Van Bruggen loves to engage in long-range psychoanalysis of people who never mentioned what their intentions were or were not. But that's how he operates. And that's how a lot of these people operate, unfortunately. And it is inconsistent to do that, and frankly, it's wrong to do that. Okay, so for us who are proponents of the critical text, we recognize that the Byzantine text type is convergent text made from many, even early readings, that is, the papyri, are part of what goes into the convergent text of the Byzantine text. That is, it comes from that train. And we also recognize that some of those early major schools like Vaticanus, they're probably not indicative of all early readings. Hort overemphasized them. But at the same time, we recognize that those major schools, while they might not be indicative of all early readings, they were definitely indicative of some. For example, manuscripts like P75, which come before Vaticanus, has a lot in common with Vaticanus. And so while Vaticanus might not cover everything, it does cover quite a bit. Okay. So it's not useless, but we don't assume that it's perfect, and we don't assume that any particular manuscript is going to be perfectly representative. Unfortunately, Hort kind of lost his balance when it came to Vaticanus. Oh, it's the great neutral text. It's more representative than anything else, and it's great and awesome, and well, maybe not. Puts even modern critical text proponents would not defend that position anymore. All right, so that is the most recent section from Van Bruggen, the third section of his little pamphlet, my response to it. And now there are some things that I want to point out for the believing proponents of the critical text. This is the part of the presentation where I explain where we're coming from. And I know that this is getting long and longer than the last one, so I'll try to keep this relatively short. But for believing proponents of the critical text, we would say that internal consistency is an absolute must. Okay, the standard of consistency has to be applied internally to, not just externally. I've been harping on that quite a bit in these presentations, that, if you would take the standard of truth over here, but you wouldn't with regard to the Bible, or you would with the Bible, but not over here, that's a sign that something is wrong. You're being inconsistent. And that's by comparison to things that are outside of talking about the subject of the New Testament text. But beyond that, we also need to make sure that we're internally consistent as well. And frankly, internal consistency really does speak to the heart of biblical Christian theology. We recognize that if the Bible were self-contradictory, then there would be no biblical theology to speak of. It would stand self-refuted because it contradicts itself. We recognize, probably more than anything else, people on both sides of the aisle recognize the need for internal consistency. If the Bible wasn't internally consistent, there'd be no reason to be a biblical Christian. Okay. And that understanding that God is consistent, not just in all areas and subjects, but especially within what he says and what he reveals, needs to be something that is a major part of our thinking. Okay, so it would be hypocritical for us to imply standards that allow us to justify some preferred readings that would also cause us to reject other preferred readings if applied to them. What do I mean? What I mean is that if I use this standard of reasoning over here in the Bible to justify the readings that I like over here, but if I were to take those same standards and still apply them within the Bible to another reading, and it wouldn't justify those ones that I do like, then that's an example of me being inconsistent. That's an example of me doing something that's wrong. If I use a standard over here that I'm not willing to use over here, still in the Bible, then I'm being inconsistent internal to the Bible, and that's also wrong. It's wrong when I use a standard regarding the biblical text that I wouldn't use anywhere else, but it's also wrong when I use a standard on one part of the text that I would not use on another. All right. And specifically, some majority text proponents inconsistently point to similarity of style and non-contradiction to bolster their acceptance of certain majority text readings. For example, there was a sermon that I was listening to, and this has been a while back, that was from someone who was a majority text proponent, and they were defending the long ending of the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6:13. And this person knows, like I think most majority text proponents know, they know that the majority text by itself is not ultimately convincing. They know that it's not an absolute standard. The majority text argument can be falsified. That is, it is hypothetically possible for the majority of readings to be incorrect. Therefore, it's not an absolute standard. And so majority text proponents do what a lot of critical text proponents do. We'll try to find other arguments that will support whatever our main argument is. We know that each of these standards by themselves is not absolute, so we combine multiple probabilistic standards to bolster our arguments. And majority texters will do it as well. And so this person's particular argument was that the long ending of the Lord's Prayer that shows up in the majority of manuscripts that says, "For of you is the kingdom and the power and the glory into the ages, Amen," he bolstered his argument for it by saying this matches Matthew's style. This is similar to other biblical passages. He talks about 1 Chronicles 29, 11 through 13, and there are some similarities, except 11 through 13 is a pretty big chunk, and the long ending of the Lord's Prayer is kind of small, so it's not a perfect parallel, but there is similarity there. And then he also goes on to say, and in addition to that, there is nothing in Scripture that contradicts this particular reading. And there's a lot to be said for those arguments. You know, that, okay, this is consistent with Matthew's style, or at least not against it. This is consistent with things that are said in other biblical passages, at least not against it. Okay, but would you be willing to use that same line of reasoning on other readings? Another reading that can be found in the manuscripts is the longer long ending of the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6. The longer long ending says, "For of you is the kingdom and the power and the glory, and the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit into the ages I pray, Amen." And this longer version of the long ending of the Lord's Prayer, it's not a majority reading, and because of that, this particular person that I was listening to would reject it just because it's not a majority reading. But all of the bolstering arguments that he used to support this majority text reading could be applied to it. It is consistent with Matthew's style. If you look at Matthew 28:19, for example, the language of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, that is basically word for word the same. It is perfectly consistent with Matthew's style. Okay, and if you're going to accept that the shorter long ending of the Lord's Prayer is consistent with Matthew's style, then the longer long ending of the Lord's Prayer is also consistent with Matthew's style. And like I said, that added part, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, comes basically right out of Matthew 28:19. It's very consistent with the style. And because it's consistent with other places in Matthew, it's obviously biblical. Nothing in Scripture contradicts it. All the bolstering arguments that this friend of mine, he is a friend of mine, that I heard preach the sermon, all of these arguments that this preacher used could be used of the longer long ending of the Lord's Prayer. And what that tells me is that at the end of the day, those bolstering arguments are inconsistent arguments, because I know that this person would not accept the longer long ending. He would not cite the Lord's Prayer as, "For of you is the kingdom and the power and the glory, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, into the ages I pray, Amen." He wouldn't cite the Lord's Prayer that way. He would cite it the first way, because that's the majority text reading. What this tells me is that all of his bolstering things to say, "Oh yes, us majority texters, we have various reasons for why we accept the majority text and things that coincide with it," all of those coinciding things, all those bolstering things, is ultimately just hot air. Because if you point to passages that meet all those criteria, they're not going to accept them. There's no way you would accept this. because it's not the majority text. That's ultimately what his standard would be, as far as anything that he would be consistent on. He only has one standard, and it's the majority text standard. All the bolstering things that he offered in his sermon to tell people, oh, and by the way, not only is it the majority text, but it has all these other great features. It's just smoke and mirrors. It's just wind. It's hot air. Okay. That's all that it is. It's all that it was. Sadly, but it's true. Okay, in that case, he's being inconsistent in how he handles material within the Bible itself. He claims to have all of these other standards that help support the majority text, but those other standards he can't apply consistently across all the variants, not even all the variants within one particular place. At Matthew 6:13, the end of the Lord's Prayer in Matthew, there are multiple endings there. And if he's going to try to provide these auxiliary arguments, these bolstering arguments, he can't do them consistently, even within variants that are within that one spot, that one verse. And so I'm looking back on this going, why did you even mention all of these other things if you can't actually apply them to another variant in that same verse? What's the point? Like I said, I could argue everything about the longer long ending that he argued about the long ending. It fits Matthew's style perfectly. It is obviously going to be similar to other biblical passages that use a triadic formula. Paul, for example, has several that have a triadic formula, and there's nothing in Scripture that contradicts it, talking about the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and praying in the name of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit is not against Scripture, certainly. Therefore, it's Scripture, right? Well, not according to him, because it's not majority text. All of the other stuff is just fluff and stuff. It's hot air. Okay, and frankly, I get sick of majority text proponents that do that kind of thing. They try to bolster the majority text with all of these other arguments that if you applied them to other variants, wouldn't work. Okay, here's all the reason why we like these majority text readings. Okay, let's apply them to some of the readings that aren't majority text readings. Would it work for them too? Oh yeah, it would. But those ones aren't majority text readings, so it doesn't count. Then why does it count? I don't know. Confusing. And here's an even more major one. The majority text proponents are inconsistent in that they violate the example of the New Testament authors. Now, a lot of them don't think about this, but the New Testament authors quote the biblical text itself, or at least reference the biblical text itself quite a few times. Now, to put this in context, we need to discuss what the Old Testament majority text is and what the New Testament authors actually do. The majority text of the Old Testament that we have today is called the Masoretic text as far as original language versions. That's the Hebrew. The most common Hebrew version of the Old Testament is the majority text, and it's supported by roughly 3,000 manuscripts. Okay, that is the majority text as we have it today, which is the same kind of standard that majority text proponents argue for with the New Testament, that the New Testament that we go with should be the majority of New Testament manuscripts that we have today. Same standard. The question, though, is that are those readings actually coincident with what the New Testament authors did? Sometimes yes, but sometimes no. The New Testament noticeably deviates from this Masoretic text about 63 times out of a total of 260 Old Testament passages that it references. That means that it diverges from this majority text about 24% of the time, about a quarter of the time. The New Testament authors do not pick something that coincides with the modern majority text. Now, their readings that they're citing may have been the majority of readings at their time, or at least in their particular place. It's a little hard to know. But the one thing that we can say for sure is that it's definitely not the modern majority text of the Hebrew Old Testament. 24% of the time, they're not there. 63 out of 260 passages that are referenced do not match the majority Hebrew version that we have today. And here's just one example, and you can actually find this in most Bibles. A lot of our Bibles, ironically, will have a majority text version of the Old Testament regardless of what they do in the New, which is really weird. But in the New Testament, for example, in Hebrews 11:21, speaking of Jacob, and talking about the end of Jacob's life, it says that he bowed his head on the head of his staff. That's what it says in Hebrews 11:21. And that actually coincides with another version of the Old Testament that's called the Septuagint. The majority version of the Septuagint actually does match that in Genesis 47:31. But the majority version of the Old Testament that we have today in the original language, the Masoretic text, it doesn't match that. Instead, the majority version of the Old Testament that we have today says that Jacob bowed his head on the head of his bed. That's not the same. Now, doctrinally, it's not overly significant. It doesn't change the doctrine of the Trinity. It doesn't change the doctrine of justification or anything like that. But that is, in terms of what actually happened, that is a big difference. Bowing on the head of his staff versus bowing on the head of his bed is not the same thing. Doctrinally, not overly significant, but it's still not the same thing. And that's the New Testament authors. They didn't go with the majority version of the text that we have available to us today. Their standard was different. And so if we're going to argue for our majority text now, we're doing that in contradistinction to the example of the New Testament authors in 24% of cases. Now, what's interesting is that critical text proponents like myself, we only differ with the majority text in about, like I said, substantially, about 5% of cases at max. A lot of people would argue less than that. But at max, about 5% of the text. The New Testament authors do it 24% of the time with regard to the version of the Bible that they themselves reference. And that's okay, evidently, because that's what they did. But the majority texters don't have a problem with that. They have a problem with us. It's just really weird and inconsistent. If it was okay for the New Testament authors to not side with the majority text 24% of the time, then why isn't it okay for us to not side with the majority text no more than 5% of the time? Pot, kettle. Okay, if what you allow and what your standards are do not match the New Testament authors, the authors of Scripture, then there's probably a problem. Just saying. All right, so that's all that I had this time. Next time, I'll of course go over the fourth section in Van Bruggen's little pamphlet, the ancient text of the New Testament. I'll respond to it, and I'll put out some more information for those who are actually interested in what a believing proponent of the critical text would be concerned with. Until then, for those of you who are in Christ, including my majority text friends, go with God and be blessed. And for those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to an understanding of the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.